Hello, my name is Ashley Walters, and I am one of the artists featured in Exotic 7 by Ballistic Publishing. It is my first art book publication and my first walkthrough, and it is an honor to have been given this opportunity to show you my process that I used on my piece entitled Elven Concept Art. I'm going to jump right in here and get started in recreating this piece so that you can see my technique. To the left I have my original file, and to the right I have a new one. Now, before I begin any painting, I like to make a sketch. And when making a sketch, first I think about the gesture of what I'm going to create. Now, gesture has a lot to do with the principle known as line of action. This principle basically is the idea that to capture dynamic movement in a pose, you want to use one or two overall shapes in the direction of the figure. Adversely, when we have arms and legs flailing about, the eye is just pulled in too many different directions, and it just doesn't look natural. By focusing on minimalizing these directions in your figure, you actually create a stronger illusion of fluid movement. So if you have an opportunity to learn about this principle, I suggest that you do. It's really helped my work as a whole. And now I'm going to go ahead and start a new document. First, I add a gradient in the background, and I sketch with a dark burgundy brush. To keep this piece fresh and keep the strong gesture intact, I stayed away from heavy reference. Instead, I focused on drawing a figure that would be typical in concept art. In other words, a more semi-realistic rendering of a person. It doesn't have to be perfect, and in fact, keeping some exaggeration in the proportions, like what you see here in her ribcage area, gives the piece more interest in my opinion. I did look at some inspirational concept art for mood and color scheme ideas, and I even took a quick picture of my hand holding a sword to make sure I had the angle correct, as hands tend to be one of the more complex shapes found in the figure. But unfortunately, I erased that file from my computer a while back, or I would show it to you here. But that was the only direct reference I used, which, as you can see here, I simplified the arm and hand quite a bit, so it was pretty loose reference overall. If you are going to use reference for a fairly dynamic pose like this, I recommend that you first draw the pose to capture the fluid movement you're looking for, and then create your own reference to match what you already have, because you don't want your reference limiting your creativity. And as you see here, I'm just sketching in, and I'm going to go ahead and move this original sketch over to save time. I don't have a lot of time to recreate this, so this will just ensure that my gesture is the same. And I'm going to go ahead and pick my colors. As you can see, I pick a nice color to start with, add a little more saturation as I go darker. This ensures that the colors are still rich without being overbearing. It's a trick that my digital illustration professor taught me in college. And at this point, I try to visualize my character, and I'm going to go ahead and move this finished sketch over here again just to save time. I'm going to show you my brush settings as well. I have my hard round brush set to other dynamics set to paint pressure. This allows me to build up paint as if I were doing something traditionally. And I just draw directly on my sketch. In this case, it's on a different layer, but sometimes I don't even do it on a different layer. I just jump right in. The only reason why I have a lot of layers in this case is because I save my steps. And also later on, being able to lock transparency of different elements, different articles of clothing, it just goes faster for me. But a lot of times I will merge as I go along. And as you can see here, I am picking a skin color for the light area and for the shadow area. And I keep those colors consistent throughout. This allows me to give a sense of the range of values that everywhere else in the piece will need. For example, her skin is the lightest thing in this picture. Therefore, her hair, which I picked this nice dark green color, it's going to have its own range of values, but should be darker than her skin. And I just keep that in mind as I go along. I make sure that the colors that I choose to render her hair are going to be, well, and actually hair itself is reflective, so the highlights might be as bright as some of the highlights in the skin, but the overall, you should have a darker look in all the other elements. And so here you see me changing my brush size as I add in the details of this piece. It's just a matter of using my bracket keys to increase and decrease the brush size as I go along. And I'm just blocking in shapes here. I'm thinking to myself, okay, if she were here, if she were made out of boxes, would this side of this box be in light or would it be in shadow? And I have a light source up to the right top of her. So I'm constantly thinking, all right, okay, if her rib cage were hit by this light, would it be in light? And if it is, I'm going to use my light color that I've already predetermined, or is it going to be in shadow? If it's going to be shadow, I'm going to go ahead and use that color I've predetermined for the shadow area. And I'm constantly thinking to myself in terms of planes in space. Not planes flying around in the sky, no, planes, spatial planes. And this allows me to accurately determine if something should be in shadow or not. And as you can see here, I am starting on the face area after I get a general quick block in. I do this for a couple of reasons. One of them is a face can make or break a piece. And if the face is successful early on, I feel it has a better chance of succeeding overall in the end. Also, I think faces are just fun, and I like to start with those. I know a lot of cases you want to attack everything at the same level. You don't want to be adding itty bitty details early on because you want to make sure that the whole piece is consistent. So you want to be careful when you do something like this. When you get to the face and you get it to a certain level, you're going to want to back off of it a little bit and bring the rest up a little bit. Otherwise, you might find later on that it's wrong, and that's when it's painful to turn around and start over. So you want to be careful when you do something like this. And so here you see me liquefying this. It's a tool that I use quite often to fix proportion problems. I think it's a great way to fix things without having to redo them. And I'm adding some reflected light here in the cheek area from the background. Little touches like that go a long way to add some realism. I'm adding some eyes here. As you can see, this is a piece that it's more quick, so I'm not going to try and go in and add a highlight, a specular highlight in her eye or worry about the color of her eyes. It's more I'm thinking to myself, okay, her eye is mostly in shadow anyway. So there's no reason to go in and put a little white spot in there, and you want to think about scale while you're doing a piece like this. And I'm going to add some highlight in her hair here. A nice blue. And again, I'm not trying to directly copy this original file here. I'm more just doing this hastily to try and get in some of my process so you can see it. This piece actually took me about 10 hours to do originally, and 10 hours is actually pretty fast for me. Most of my stuff that I do takes about 30 hours or so, but even though this was quote-unquote fast, it still takes a long time. It's just a matter of coming in and adding little details here and there and that go a long way to really bring it up to par. And again, a lot of it has to do with just reducing your brush size and coming in and adding subtle variations in value. Remember, in the shadow area, you don't need a lot of variation in value unless you have a very reflective surface. Her hair here is a little bit reflective. That's why I'm adding a little more variation in value. But overall, I'm trying to keep her highlight area separate from her shadow area. A clear definition of where the plane changes will occur. And as I continue on here, I'm going to go ahead and erase some of these edges of my sketch just to clean it up as I go along. And I'm not afraid to erase parts of the sketch that I've already sketched in. It's a very loose process overall. And let's see here. Now I'm going to go ahead and render her skin a little more. And again, I'm thinking to myself, alright, well, if this isn't light, then what are the subtle transition values I need to merge them with the shadow areas? That's where you're going to find your largest range of value, is merging your midtones with your shadow areas. Now I'm going to go ahead and move over my original file here just to, no, actually, this is better reference anyway. I'm going to go ahead and render some close here so you can kind of see my process a little bit. More detail in the skin. And again, one of the reasons why I think this piece is successful is for two reasons. One of them is that I'm not afraid to render hard cast shadows. The other reason why, I believe, is because I'm keeping my midtones close in value and my shadows close in value. I did this by thinking about surface type, which I've already touched on a little bit. So with skin, you get a slight bit of reflective dewiness that merits occasional specular highlights, like what you see here on her lip. But with the cotton-like fabric, like she's wearing, you get a rather matte surface, as the fabric is not highly reflective. Therefore, there are no highlights in the fabric. I capture that effect by not going completely dark in my shadow area of the clothing and consistently keeping it the same color throughout, with a slight variation to show form. Be a little bit darker where you need to, but not too much. Don't go as dark as you can just because you can. And here I'm correcting some more proportion problems with the liquify tool. I'm going to shrink her head here. I tend to have a problem with making heads very big for some reason. Anyway, so the shadows should be noticeably darker than the darkest of midtones. Also, almost every area cast in shadow should be flat. In other words, close to the same value throughout each element. There should be very few variations of value reserved for the darkest areas, never going fully black, as I said. So you see here, everywhere her skin is cast in shadow is the same darkness, with just a hint of darker values around the edges of her body to show form. By the same token, the midtones in the skin are going to be very close to the same value, with some transitions to blend the midtones into the shadows, as I talked about. By keeping everything close in value, I achieve cohesiveness. The only exception to this is the metal armor, which I am rendering right now, because metal is a very reflective surface. It has abrupt and extreme value changes. In other words, you're going to have a much darker than anywhere else in your picture, and going almost all the way to white, because that's how reflective metal is. And in my opinion, it makes it rather easy to render, because I simply think to myself, okay, exaggerate everything. Make your darks darker and your lights lighter. I also try to work any color close to the metal into the metal itself, and that just adds a little hint of realism. So sometimes it's best to render metal after you've already rendered some of the surrounding elements. It just helps you as you go along to work in, for instance, some of her skin tone I've added in some reflective light. And again, I'm just adding some highlights here, going in and darkening some areas. I'm going to add a little shadow here, constantly thinking to myself, is this in shadow or is this in light? Every little area. I'm going to add some details here on the underside of her armor here. This just gives you an idea of my process and how I'm working it. Right around here, I'm going to add some curvature to these little armor platelets by taking the color of the plates and bending them around the form. First, I'm going to add some more shadow in here. And so you see here that I'm adding a little bit of curvature to them. It just helps you see how the armor wraps around her. You don't just want to have something sticking straight out because it's not going to look realistic. I'm going to talk a little bit about cast shadow versus form shadow now. I'm going to render some cast shadow under her armor here. Now, as I said, rendering cast shadows allows you to have small areas really pop out at you. Of course, knowing the difference between form and cast shadow is essential to proper rendering of form. Form shadows are present when plane changes occur. In many cases, like found here in this sphere, the core shadow of the sphere, this will result in a soft, gradual transition from your midtone to your shadow area. Most form shadows in a figure are caused when a bony or fatty surface of the body curves in such a way that it is no longer in light, like the cheek area in many portraits you see, or in this case, the ribcage area is a great example of that. Cast shadows, however, are sharper than most form shadows and are caused when some part of the form blocks the light from hitting another part of the form. For instance, her armor here is getting in the way of the light reaching her chest right under where her armor meets her skin. The closer the shadow to the object that's blocking the light, the sharper the shadow will appear. So don't be afraid to render hard cast shadows. I see a lot of people who draw these great portraits, but they have super blurry shadows everywhere, and no cast shadows present. And it really holds you back. So, I mean, go for it. It might seem weird at first, like when I drew the cast shadow at the very beginning, when I drew that cast shadow in her hair, I thought, well, that's going to look weird. But I thought, I've already established the light source. Let's just see where this goes. I'm going to go ahead and add this weird dark area right in the middle of her nicely rendered hair. And lo and behold, it looked all right. And so don't be afraid to experiment. If it doesn't work, you learn from your mistakes. And if it does, you are rewarded with a new technique to use in your arsenal. I think overall, art is a game of trial and error. We get better by taking risks and learning from them, even our mistakes. So don't be afraid to get in there and really render it. I'm going to go ahead and add some more detail to her clothing here. Now, as I start working on this, I want to talk about the whole idea of keeping your values closer range. As you can see here, even her shadow area and her clothing here, it's not that very different from the light area, but that's all you need to make it realistic. I'm just going in here and adding some details, sharpening some edges. You don't have to get super realistic to get a good result. So after I created all these individual elements, I blocked in these shapes. I actually went in my layers palette and I locked the transparency of my layer so that I could go in and color right over it without worrying about coloring outside the lines. And this is really how I did every separate element. I went in and I did her clothing, then I went in and I did her area around her clothing around her waist, and then her armor, her nice middle armor that she's wearing on her legs here. All of those were separate layers. I want to show you the finished product here. After I created all these different elements, I went ahead and I added some nice effects like some smoke and darkened the background a little bit, added some nice rays coming down from the top here, and it just allows me to make it look complete. I also added a nice little glare to the sword to make it feel like it's really interacting with the light. So I really overemphasized the light source in this piece. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so successful. It's got this nice 3D look to it. One of my more successful pieces. I'm going to go ahead and show you the step-by-step process that I kept all these steps in my original file, and this is the original file. All the layers that I kept. And as you can see here, I'm adding element upon element. And as I add each new element, they interact with each other. And I'm adding cast shadows and thinking constantly again about the light source. And there you have it. I did last few effects there, but that's it right there. So I hope this walkthrough was helpful for you. It was very fun to make. If you have any questions for me, don't hesitate to ask. You can find me at ashleywalters.net or lithreel.deviantart.com, and you can find my latest works on my blog at ashleywalters.blogspot.com. And I wish you the best in your artistic endeavors. Thank you, and goodbye.